tonight is going to be about chastity topics as well. And I will say now, next week will be handling rejection. And I have a funny, awesome blind date story. It's like the greatest date story ever to share next week. Little teaser. And I don't think I told it last fall. At least I don't think I did. So we'll be talking about that. And then we'll have possibly two sets of couples talking next week about giving their testimonial, as well as addressing holy friendships, setting boundaries, things like that. So that'll be the theme next week. All right. So tonight's just going to an overview of chastity, an overview, kind of what, if you came last fall to the Theology of the Body talks that I had, we went over this at length. We also mentioned, and I'm going to talk about again tonight, the comparison, the God's love for us, and then the vows that married couples promise in the rite of marriage, and how that's reflective of God's free, total, faithful, and fruitful love for us. And then we'll close. I'll close my talk with just some other resources, and it'll make for some great, interesting, I think, conversation tonight. I have no slides tonight. I apologize. I'm going to blame my family for taking me to the Tigers game, and then we went to the Lions game last night, so that was not planned. They won. They beat the Patriots. I don't know if anyone cares. Okay. It was my first NFL game, so I thought I don't have time to make slides for you guys. Yeah. What?
They won for you.
They did win for me. It was all about me. So it was a very long day. Before I forget. So I'm going to talk briefly tonight about pornography, and I want to just mention that we talked about this actually last spring in the Engage the Culture talk, which the young adults, I just give the credit to the young adult ministry. They recorded it, and then they just posted it on the OLGC YouTube page like 2 weeks ago, something like that. And I addressed that probably at great length in that talk, so I don't really want to repeat that. That has some really good information, though, and it's a brief talk. It's not that long. Okay. So, and it's called Engage the Culture, answering the sexual confusion of the day, or culture, yeah, something like that. Yeah. So, and it was just posted just less than 2 weeks ago. All right. So, as far as chastity, the difference between chastity and abstinence. Does anybody know the difference between chastity and abstinence right away? I'll tell you. I know. It's like, everyone raised their hand. Let's talk about chastity. I'm like, oh.
Abstinence is just like abstaining from sex, and then chastity is just doing it for like an actual purpose.
Right. I would say, yeah, abstaining. Oh, wow. See, now I'm doing it. You got me doing it. So chastity is a virtue, and it takes practice, right? So abstaining, and by the way, I would just love to be like an abstinence-only educator. Like, I guess they exist, right? Do they just go into a room and just say, don't do it, and they leave? Because, I mean, that's all that abstaining is. Like, you're just abstaining, right? And it doesn't take a lot of practice to abstain, because, we're all abstaining right now. It's when you're dating somebody, it's when you actually have feelings for someone else, then it becomes difficult, right? That it's like, I need to practice this virtue. But I think the word chastity, we need to reclaim that word. I think it has a lot of negative connotations. We talked about this in previous discussions. But, if you ask the person on the street, even do they know what the word chastity even means? Could they even give you a definition? They might not even know. They might not even be in their vocabulary. They might just think that it's the equivalent of abstaining. Like, there's no beauty to it. Whereas it's actually a really beautiful thing, because it's virtue, and it's something that we practice to learn how to love someone rightly. So to love someone, the definition to love someone is to will the good of the other. So if you're practicing chastity, you're practicing how to learn how to love them in the right way. And it's sacrificial, right? So that's what love is. It's sacrifice. And we learned when we talked about theology of the body that what's going to bring us true happiness? It's going to make when we make a gift of ourselves, when we sacrifice and make a self-donation of ourselves. So that's sacrifice isn't, it's not it has kind of a negative connotation to it. It's because it's hard, right? It's hard to do this. It's not easy. Because if it was easy, we would be living in a totally different world. And we have this ongoing battle between love and lust, right? So that's why chastity can be really challenging and difficult. And the couple that talked last week, they mentioned that. They were kind of general about it, but they said that when they first started dating, they were living for themselves. They were both very selfish, and it wasn't a chaste relationship. It wasn't until when they got back together, which for those that missed it, again, we'll be posting online. It was a great, great testimonial. But they said, well, when they got back together, they were both kind of had a better relationship with the Lord. They had worked on that in their singleness, and therefore they wanted to practice chastity. Like they desired it because they knew that was the way to learn how to love somebody in the right way. Okay, I'm going to steal this. I stole this from Father Prentice. So I observed, and I mentioned this the first night that we all met, that I observed the marriage prep class where they talk about, natural family planning, and Father Prentice just gave this great talk, and he explained, marriage and why you need to wait, until you're married to have sex in 20 minutes better than any. I mean, he didn't even say. It was just beautiful the way he did it. I was like, can I just record this and just spout this off? It was beautiful. But he said this one line that I wrote down, and I was like, this is great. He said, what you say in the bedroom. So let me rewind. Our bodies have a language, right? If you are familiar with theology of the body, we talked about that. And if you don't know, well, newsflash, our bodies speak a language. And what we do, what we say, it matters. And so he's saying what you speak or what you say in the bedroom, meaning the conjugal union, right? What you say in the bedroom is what you vowed at the altar. So you make this promise at the altar as a married couple, and then you act that out in the bedroom, right? In the marital act. So then I think he said, I wrote this down. I don't know if he actually said this, but I think I wrote down. So how can you speak in the bedroom when you haven't vowed yourself to the other yet? So that was his way of saying, this is meant to be done after you're married. But he said in such a way that it made total sense. I was looking around the room, I'm like, does anybody else understand it? Like, this is so great. I don't know if they caught it, but I did. I was like, this is so great. Like, what you say in the bedroom, and it makes sense. What you say in the bedroom is what you vowed at the altar. So that's a way for us to think about, so what I'm promising at the altar matters. This is why marriage is a sacrament, right? So really quickly, because I want to get to Becky and Joe, but so have you heard, not from me, but outside, either in a talk or something about theology of the body, free, total, faithful, fruitful, like before I started babbling that. Have you ever heard that in a chastity talk, or am I talking? Okay, no? Oh, okay, we'll start over. All right. So, but this is a really easy way to start a conversation about why we believe what we believe as Catholics concerning sex and marriage. It's probably the easiest way for me to remember and for me to teach it to others. So, how does Christ love us? He loved us by giving himself up freely. Totally. He gave his whole self. He didn't hold anything back. Faithfully. He faithfully laid down his life for us. And fruitfully. His love bore fruit. So this is parallel to what the married couple promises at the altar. The priest asks them certain questions. Have you come here freely? Yes, you're not coming there forced. No one's forcing you into this marriage, right? Do you promise to give yourself totally to somebody until death and faithfully? So it's free, total and faithful, right? All of myself, 100%. And do you and will you accept children lovingly from God? Fruitful. So it's right there in the rite of marriage. It's right there. So the couple promises this, and what they say matters. They're vowing themselves to each other, and they're promising that what they're saying at the altar is going to be reflected in their lives, right? So it would just look, so when we take the opposite of it, so this is an easy way to think about it. So freely, of course, that's pretty easy to think about. Like, well, is this am I coming here freely? Yes. Hopefully you're not forced into marrying somebody, right? Totally. Well, they give all of themselves. If they were to say, like, no to that question, like, do I give myself totally? It would be like saying, I'm going to love you 75% of the time. You know, the other 75% or 25% of me is going to be dedicated to other things like football or my friends or whatever. That's what that's saying. You're going to give yourself totally to them. You're not going to hold anything back. And that includes your fertility, right? You're going to give yourself totally a self-donation to the other person. Faithfully, I think that's pretty obvious. But again, you want to give yourself faithfully. You're going to be faithful to that person, faithful to the vows and faithful to them the whole time. And until death, you know, it's a covenant. It's a lifelong commitment, right? And fruitful, well, it's obvious. You know, that's the obvious one. So am I promising to welcome children from God, right? So free, total, faithful, fruitful. And what's the best part about this? So one quick funny story, and then we'll get to the bad story, or the bad news. But the good news, when I first heard that, like, explanation of marriage, it helps me. Because it just helped me understand this is why it's a sacrament. This is why. I get it. Like, because the married couple, they're trying to get each other to heaven. They're reflecting God's love for the church. Like, this makes sense to me. Like, that made sense. But then when I heard, because we've already talked about people have a hard time accepting the church's teaching on contraception. But when I heard, you know, the part about being fruitful, I was reminded of the words that we recite in the Creed, the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the Lord and giver of life, right? That's what we say. For me, that was just like, I'm sold. Like, I get it. For others, maybe it's not as obvious, but it's like, it just elevated marriage, and now I understand the conjugal union between the husband and wife. Like, for me, even as a single person, I was just like, this is so amazing. I want to tell everybody about it. So I did. I tried. So and one of the lines that they say, they're like, because it's true, what you do in the bedroom, it's kind of like you're renewing your wedding vows. So I used that line. I was like, I'll explain that to people. Like, this is great, because I'm sure people don't know this. So the first married couple I encountered after I learned theology of the body, and I was driving home. I think I maybe have told the story last fall. It's a long story. But anyways, I learned it within a week. I was at the Institute, driving home from this retreat, and I'm like, I got to tell somebody what I just heard, because this is just amazing. I'm sure they don't even know how great marriage is, right? So I call someone I'm very close to, that I may or may not be related to, and I'm like, do you know every time you and your husband have sex, you're renewing your wedding vows? Isn't that amazing? And like, her reaction on the other end of the phone could not have been more like, oh my God, what? And her reaction, I think this is funny. Some people might find it sad, but I think it's funny. She's like, I mean, it's awkward, right? But I'm just like bursting with this information. I'm like, did you know that? Because I didn't know that. I think that's awesome. And she's like, well, you know, sometimes it's spiritual, but sometimes I'm making my grocery list in my head. Like, I don't know, you know. So but it was a good, like, bring Michelle back down to earth. Like, this is how it really is. Like, I mean, it's great, you know. I remember her reaction, like, it's great that you learned all of this, but like, she kind of rained in my parade a little bit. I was like, isn't it? So is it like that every time? Like, is it spiritual? You know. Well, I'm gonna, and so I said, and I still do pray this, but I told her this, and again, I had a strange reaction, naturally, but I was like, well, I'm gonna pray that your unions are really, like, spiritually, like, fruitful, and they're, like, really great. I think she almost hung up the phone on me at that point. Like, okay. What happened to that was my sister. Anyways. Okay, so now that we've I know it's a very brief overview, but it's a very good way to just look at the sincerity of the importance of the vows and what you say at that altar means. What does it really mean? This is a big deal, clearly. So when it comes to the sins, though, the sexual sins, this is a good gauge, right? And before, I hope I've mentioned it before. If I haven't, I'm sorry. But we should always mention that when we talk about sin, you need to talk about the sacrament of reconciliation and how blessed we are as Catholics that we have that sacrament, that we can go and fly to Jesus when we fail, as we a lot of times will, right? So why, some of the questions will be like, well, why is it such a big deal? So first of all, premarital sex, sex outside of marriage. Why is this a sin? Because some people, honestly, really don't think it's that big of a deal. We hardly ever talk about it. I don't know the last time I heard a homily from the pulpit about premarital sex, right? I mean, we kind of just are like, let's just not talk about it. But you can ask if it measures up. So is it free? Like, are you freely doing this? Some people will probably say, well, it's a free choice. You're not being forced. Well, could you be being pressured into it, though? Because how many times have we heard, and some people have a lot of experience with this, with the other person saying, well, if you love me, though, never mind that we're not married yet. If you love me, we'll do this, right? If you love me, we'll have sex. If you love me, you'll move in with me. If you love, X, Y, or Z. And I tell people, I'm like, well, it wasn't until someone told me, they're like, that's not love. That's not practicing chastity. That's a threat. That's not love. Like, how is that loving somebody? If you truly love them, you don't want to lead them into sin. You don't want to lead yourself into sin, right? So you would never threaten somebody by saying, well, if you love me, you'll do this. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. That's literally a threat, right? So maybe it's free. Maybe it's a free choice for both the man and the woman, but a lot of times it might not be. They just feel this pressure to do that. Is it total? Well, most people, let's just assume, that aren't married, most of the time they're contracepting, right? Because they're not in a committed relationship. They're not ready to be a parent. So they're probably practicing some form of birth control. So that's not giving your total self to one another. You're holding back your fertility. Is it faithful? Well, there's no commitment until death do you part. You haven't committed to yourself. You haven't committed to one another. You're just engaging in this act. And is it open to life? As we said, probably chances are it's probably not. So it's sending a message that you're just not ready to commit. Like, you're willing to do this. Like, I'm ready to go here with you, but I'm not ready to be married to you, right? So it's just it's just a different way to look at it that way. And we talked about this. We talked about the hookup culture. This is just kind of the mantra of the hookup culture. Like, well, as long as they're consenting, what's the big deal? Well, you're not yoked to that person yet. You haven't made any promises to that person. You could just leave them at any time, but yet you've already engaged in this act with them. So it doesn't measure up to the free, total, faithful, fruitful. Cohabitation is just something I never even thought I would even be talking about. I talk about it with teens, and they were so grateful, especially the girls. They were like, God, that makes a lot of sense, because they see people who are living together before they're married. And we know the stats. We mentioned it in the past, more likely to be divorced or more likely not to become married. But all that aside, again, you're acting as if you are married and you haven't vowed yourself to that person yet. So it doesn't really make much sense. And the example I use with the teens, or the analogy I use with teens, is probably one that you've heard. But you don't want to be test driven like a car. It doesn't sound very appealing, right? Like, let's move in together to save some money. Well, okay, but what is that doing to you? Again, it's obviously not a form of practicing chastity. And even if you are trying to be chaste, like, let's say we're going to move in together, but we're not going to have sex. I think that's a little difficult to do, because you're with that person and you're alone with them. That's literally just tempting fate right there. So it's not. It might not be a free choice to live together. It doesn't measure up. It's not total, because it's a test period. It's not. Is it really faithful? Because again, there's no commitment. And And is it open to life? Probably not, once again. So you can see how these don't quite measure up, right? I mean, does it start to make sense? Like, okay, if I'm discerning marriage and I'm taking this seriously, this just doesn't add up, right? So I have one more bad news, and I promise we'll end on a fun note, I promise. I know, but we have to talk about these things, right? Because it's just important I think it's important just to get it all out so we understand, right? So we have to understand the opposite of marriage, I guess you would say, before we could talk about what marriage is, right? So pornography, masturbation, usually they're talked about at the same time. Again, it's a topic I addressed last spring. I think it's pretty obvious why these don't measure up free, total, faithful, fruitful. But it's something that I thought was very interesting as one of the... this is affecting relationships and marriages now probably more than ever. I mean, it's being talked about openly, which is really good, but how much of a problem it is. It's a billion-dollar industry, maybe more. I don't know the exact numbers. What we talked about in the spring was basically just the connection. We mentioned briefly the connection to human trafficking, which if you were at OLGC this weekend, it was Freedom Sunday, and we had a homily about human trafficking, which I don't know any other parish that has that or that does that, which is it's really great to shed light on these things. There's a book that I want to recommend for just your information. It's called Restored by Matt Fradd, and it's just testimonials from married couples that have been affected by pornography addiction. And it's heartbreaking to read, but it's very necessary, I think, to see that this was not talked about openly before they were married, right? So because it's there's an element of shame attached to it, right? And I think in most of the cases it was the man, but some cases it is the woman too, that's addicted. And they don't discuss these things before they get married. And they think, in many cases, I won't have this addiction, I won't have this problem once I become married, because they think it'll solve it, which I think a lot of people, we run into that problem, right? Marriage will solve our problems. If I have a baby, this will solve everything, right? It's just made it worse. And the damage, it's very heartbreaking, but I think it's necessary to kind of just read these stories so we can have those conversations. There's plenty of other websites. I think I mentioned them in the other talk. Fight the New Drug is probably the most popular one. And Integrity Restored. IntegrityRestored.com offers help for those people. So, and it's a huge issue. Father John gave a talk about it once that said it's everybody. Because he's in the confessional, right? So he hears this. And those people that are just confessing it. So there is support now, thank God. There's support group here at OLGC for husbands and wives, men and women, which I think is great. Which it's sad that we need to talk about it, but it's escalated into a huge issue. And for those that watched The Dating Project, that movie, they did mention it in the movie. There's just one line. Like, it's just like the girls are sitting around talking about dating, and the one girl says something like, well, what's the big deal? I don't know if the exact line is like, what's the big deal? But she basically tells the other girl, like, so you're going to be mad if your boyfriend watches porn? Like, what's the big deal? And she couldn't really, they don't show what the rest of the conversation was like, but some people have an attitude where it's not a big deal. Well, I mean, that's not love that you're watching on the screen. You know, that's abuse in a lot of cases. A lot of those girls are underage. I mean, this is a big deal, right? I don't know if we really need to do the free, total, faithful, fruitful. It's clearly none of those things. It's not even free. It's not even a free choice to engage in that, because a lot of people who are addicted become addicted and feel trapped. They are bound by that sin. So it's not even a free choice for them to do that. It's like a drug addiction, right? They don't want to. So anyways, I would just encourage, we need to talk about these things. So in your Q&A tonight, one of the questions will be how we can address topics, even just chastity in general, the topics that you have to address as you're dating somebody, as you're discerning marriage. When is it appropriate to bring those up? Like when, and so I posed the question to you guys to kind of discuss at your tables. how do you have those conversations? Because they need to happen if you're going to be married to this person, right? I promised a funny story, didn't I? Did I tell it yet? I don't remember. What was the funny... Wait, what? My sister, I told that one. Darn it. I thought I had another one because I said, I'm like, we're going to end on a high note. Oh, yes. Oh, this is such a great story. Okay. Now that I built it up so much. Okay, because it goes along with kind of how I met Becky. I think I met you at something, both of you guys, at a event. I don't know. But I knew Becky as she's the one that teaches natural family planning. I'm like, awesome. Okay, so this was just a year ago. And you guys know, I told you, I just turned 40, right? So this is how late I learned this. And Becky will get a kick out of this. Well, everyone will, I think, I hope. Okay, so it's a year ago. It's like last June, right before I moved here. I went to, it's called the Vita Institute. It's hosted by Notre Dame in South Bend. And it's this pro-life, 10-day long, it's seminars and classes, and it's just a bunch of pro-life people getting together to talk. Let's just put it that way. The last day was a fertility care practitioner. She's giving a talk about natural family planning, and you would think well, what does this have to do with pro-life and abortion? Well, it has everything to do with it because we need to educate and inform our young girls and men, of course, about how their bodies work, right? Because that's how babies are made, right? So she has this one line, and I felt like an idiot for not knowing this earlier, but just the way she said it, she's like, well, yeah, I talk to, my clients are, a lot of times they're married couples, but sometimes they're engaged or they're dating or they're younger or whatever, it doesn't matter. And she goes, I'll have a couple that's trying to be chaste, they're not open to life, but they're trying to practice chastity. And she goes, so it helps, if the girl knows when she's ovulating, because the urge to merge is very high. And they don't want to be alone together, that would probably be a day they don't want to be alone together. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I should have learned that 20 years ago. Someone should have told me. I mean, it's just the way she said, she's like, the urge to merge is really high at that point. So that's helpful for the couple to know. I'm like, yeah, it's helpful. Why would you, I'm just saying, I think this could help a lot of people, especially the guy, so you wouldn't, it's not a Netflix and chill kind of night. Let's not do that. Let's maybe be apart tonight. Anyways, I guess I was laughing at just the patheticness that I had never heard it phrased that way. And because I had never charted, I was like, oh my gosh, every girl, all young girls should know this. And then it's just so amazing. Okay, shameless plug for NFP. All right. Okay, so do we have any, I wanted to mention one more thing. I'm sorry. I'm going longer than 15 minutes. Wow, I went way over. But I think it's important for those of us, because I think everyone here is single, practicing chastity as single people is very difficult, right? And I have found that prayer works very well, besides adoration, besides confession. And so I tell young, this is what I would say to young girls, especially to girls, because I think, guys, I'm sorry, girls and boys, but especially girls need to know, they need to know that their sexual desires are normal. I just think that's something that we don't get across to young girls. I think they just hear, only boys have that problem. And it's no, you're normal. You're a human being for having desires, for having sexual desires, right? It's how when we act on them, that's when we get in trouble, right? So as far as trying to remain chaste, trying to live our universal call to holiness, right? It's really difficult, and it gets more and more difficult as we're discerning marriage with somebody, probably, right? But I have found that prayer works wonders. I stole this prayer. Christopher West has a few that he recommends in his book. Untwist in me what sin has twisted. That's just a general one that you can just pray. Untwist in me what sin has twisted. And the one that came to me, and I think I told this before, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I found it helpful. I got an answer in prayer. I was literally driving, and I just remember, how sometimes you can just remember those moments with God. And he basically said, try to see the men in your life as brothers in Christ. not as potential lovers. Like, see them with eyes of Christ, not with eyes of lust. And I think men and women can both relate. Men can say, like, help me to see the women in my life as my sisters in Christ first, right? It's about respecting the dignity of the human person, right? That's all what theology of the body says. So it's the same thing. Because we don't want eyes of lust. We want to see them with eyes of love, okay? With pure love. So purify my intentions, purify my thoughts. Because Jesus can heal. Jesus he does do that, right? That's what the message is. That, of course, on our own, to live a chaste life is very difficult, but with God's grace, we can do it. Okay? All right, that's it. That's all from me tonight. Okay, so I will introduce now Becky and Joe. Is there like a little accent? Is it Jordano? Like Jordano? Or just Jordano? Jordano, okay, all right. I thought I heard like a little, I don't know, Italian. So Becky and Joe are going to come up here and give us their lovely testimonial. So give them a warm welcome.
My name is Joe Jordano. This is my lovely wife, Becky, and tonight we're here to answer one question. How does a guy like this end up with a girl like that? Right? So, there's 4 things we want to talk about tonight. 1, we're just going to tell our story about how we met. 2, we're going to talk about how to embrace your singlehood. 3, we're going to give you some tips for dating. And 4, we're going to just wrap up with maybe some tips on breaking up. All right? Does that sound all right? Let's just open in a word of prayer if we can. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Oh, Heavenly Father, we thank you for this great gift of being together tonight. We thank you for the gift of life, the gift of friendship and fellowship, and the gift of faith. And Lord, I just thank you for each of my brothers and sisters here tonight, and I ask, oh Lord, that you'd send your Holy Spirit to be with us, to guide our conversation, to open our hearts to whatever it is that is from you, and to help us to forget anything that I or Becky say that is not of you. Lord, we thank you that you offer us joy in every situation, every moment in our life. And we thank you that you've given us all a vocation to live out. And so, Lord, I hope that we can leave here tonight with a greater hope and courage of discovering our vocation if we haven't yet. And just a greater joy in knowing you and the good plans you have for our lives. And we ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, so how we met. So we just celebrated 8 years of marriage. Thank you. Yeah. She didn't think we were going to make it. I told her.
At least you remembered this one. So.
I did forget our first anniversary. It was in another story. But anyway, so basically 9 years ago, we were in your seat. And that might sound like a long time, but it feels like yesterday, to be honest. So we were both living in the Washington, D.C. area at the time. And Washington, D.C. has a ton of young adults. And there's a ton of Catholic young adult activities to participate in. And between the two of us, we hit them all. We both moved to D.C. within a month of each other, but it took us 4 years to meet. And we met playing Ultimate Frisbee in Arlington, Virginia. Apparently it's a thing like Catholics do, at least in D.C. I don't know about you guys. I had never done it before. But so she was more involved in the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. young adult activities, and I was more involved in the Arlington ones, which was one of the reasons we hadn't met. But literally, we were both spending a fair bit of time going to events like this and everything else. Primarily to meet our spouse, let's be honest. I mean, there were some other benefits of like growing in the faith and, yada, yada, yada. But really, it was like, you're looking for your spouse, right? I mean, it's a captive audience. So, but after 4 years of attending these events, we hadn't met each other until that one fateful day on the Ultimate Frisbee field. And I went that day, it was the second time I'd gone, and I went for the same reason I went to every other event, to meet my wife. She actually went that day, not with that intent, but just wanting a little bit of exercise.
I like ultimate frisbee. I really just wanted to play.
Yeah. She was also training for the Marine Corps marathon when I met her. So she was just like in crazy shape, long distances, short distances. It didn't matter. And so we're out there playing, and it was just pickup style. And I noticed her fairly early on. And the first thing I noticed about her was like, she was the most competitive person out there. Like everyone out there is kind of like jogging along, like, oh, maybe I'll catch her. She's like throwing elbows. And I was like, I got to meet this girl. That's pretty cool. So in between the breaks, I like conveniently positioned myself to be in the group of people who were talking. And what was evident during these breaks was that there was another guy there who had the same intent. And so I'm like looking at this guy being like, dude, come on. Go talk to somebody else, So, but he didn't. And so anyway, long story short, after about an hour and a half of playing, I'm like, could barely breathe. She's not even huffing and puffing. I was like, I gotta go. I was like, I gotta go. And so I'm literally, this is what I'm doing. I'm walking to my car, and I'm thinking, I had 4 data points in my head. This is all I knew about her. Her name was Becky. She went to Steubenville because she was wearing a Steubenville shirt, and we had talked about it briefly. She was a social worker in D.C., and she lived in Hyattsville, Maryland. So this is me. I'm walking in my car, and I'm like, Becky, Steubenville, Hyattsville, social worker, Becky, Steubenville. And then it popped in my head. I was like, I know someone who knows her. He's got to know her. I have this friend named Brendan, who was very active in the young adult community in Hyattsville. So I'm driving away, and I'm like speed dialing this guy. I'm like, Brendan, her name is Becky. She went to Steubenville. She's a social worker, and she lives in Hyattsville. Tell me you know her. And this is like over voicemail. So he calls me back, like an hour later, or whatever. He's like, I totally know her. I'm like, thank God. I was like, I couldn't ask for her number because this other tool there was like trying to hit on her. It would have been awkward. So I was like, well, do me a favor. Can you ask for her number? Can you say, hey, you met my buddy Joe? Like, can I get your number? Can you ask? Yeah. A week goes by, and I'm like, dude, if she said no, just tell me. Like, it's all right. But these things have like a time limit, Like in another couple days, she's not going to know who Joe was, So, so he's like, dude, I don't know. I haven't heard back from her. I'm like, all right, fine.
So meanwhile, I left that Frisbee field thinking, I think I'm going to go back there. That Joe guy seemed a little interesting. I left, I'm from Michigan, so I came back here to Michigan. My mom was way out in the country, no internet. That was before smartphones, or at least I didn't have one. So I was there for a week, didn't check voicemail, didn't check email, nothing. I come back to D.C. after a week. I get the email from Brendan saying, hey, can I give this guy your phone number? I respond, oh, sure. He was in Wisconsin for a week and didn't check his email for another week. So by this time, 2 weeks had gone by, and poor Joe was sitting there being like, what is going on?
But then, one night, I'll never forget, it was 11 o'clock at night, and I get this text from Brendan. He's like, you still up? I'm like, dude, I'm up. So he's like, here's her number. She said you can, you said you can give her a call. And I don't know, are we telling the rest of the story now? Or I guess we are.
I'll tell it later.
You'll tell the rest later? Yes?
I'm not sure what you're going to say, but...
Well, just like the rest of our story. Does that come later? Or just...
You can tell.
Okay, so anyway,
We should practice.
we go on our first date, and this is
All right. We'll finish later.
All right, we'll finish. It all worked out. Let's just say. Okay. All right. So that's in a nutshell how we met. So here's the next sort of transition. That's not going to transition very smoothly. But did anyone happen to go to the Lansing Diocese Made for Happiness conference this weekend? Okay. So a few of you. All right. So I'm going to steal from Father Mike Schmitz because I love that guy and he's stealable. So he made this awesome point that I just think is so true, and I don't want to project on anyone here, but when I was sitting in your seat, just to say, I was 31, almost 32 when we met, and I was 32, almost 33 when we got married. So in my mind, that was like a lot later in life than I intended to get married, right? So when I was in some of your shoes, perhaps, there is this tendency to be like, oh, I'll be happy when? I'll be joyful when? Oh, as soon as I meet, the woman I'm going to marry, it'll be awesome, right? And he made this beautiful point. He's like, whenever something is done, whether it's my singlehood or this exam I'm studying for or this job or this whatever, then I will be happy. Then I'll be joyful. And that's just like a terrible way to go through life, right? So the gift that we have when we're single, and it may feel like this, it may not feel like this, but trust me, with few exceptions, the gift that you have when you're single is your time, right? And so the question is, how are you going to invest the time that you have now? Not so that I'll be this perfect marriable person, right? Because what is that, right? But so that you will find joy and fulfillment in your state of life. Because the grass is always greener, right? I mean, think about this. Roughly half of marriages end in divorce. So it's pretty safe to say those people weren't happier married, right? They deliberately chose not to be married. That's the half that actually gets divorced. What about the half that stays together and, at least at times, are miserable together? Hopefully not often, but it does happen. So what is this season of preparation about? I would argue it's about learning to be joyful and peaceable and content in any season, in any circumstance. And again, Father Mike Schmitz, I think, made such a beautiful message on that. I'm sure they're going to post it online. I'd recommend you listening to it. And again, it's not so that I will be this marriable person. It is that so I learn to be content in any situation, so when I am married and things are tough, or we're going through challenges or whatever the case may be, I know how to find happiness and contentment and joy in that stage of life that I thought was like the be-all and end-all, and I'm now realizing is at times equally lonely or equally frustrating or equally whatever the case may be. So what do we want to invest our time in? Well, I would argue we want to invest our time in things that are going to help us to be the person we want to be, not only in this season of life, but in the next season of life to come. So the first thing, and I'm sure you guys have covered this in other talks, it sounds like the Kroger-Meyers may have talked about it, I know Michelle's talked about it, is this idea of a daily prayer routine, right? So it's not that you can't do that or shouldn't do that or won't be able to do that once you're married, but I will say it gets a lot harder once you are. So my routine, when I lived in D.C., I had the privilege of living about a mile from a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week perpetual adoration chapel. And when I moved to D.C., I didn't even know what perpetual adoration was. I'd been Catholic my entire life, and I literally didn't know what it was. And someone said to me, oh, why don't we go to the perpetual adoration chapel? And I was like, okay, whatever that is, And then I just fell in love with Jesus in the Eucharist, in exposition. And so I had gotten into this pretty great routine where I would just stop by the chapel at the end of the day for however long I wanted, whatever the case may be. Then we get married, and it's like, oh, I can't just do that anymore. First of all, we lived farther from this chapel. But second of all, it was like, oh, maybe she had dinner ready, or we were going to go for a run together, or whatever the case may be. And now all of a sudden, I had to adjust my schedule and really try and fit prayer in. Fast forward several years later, we now have 3 little boys. You can imagine how hard it is for Becky to find that time to get to the chapel, or even just to pray without 3 little boys clamoring all over her. So invest in that daily time of prayer. Get to adoration if you can. If you didn't know it, there's a 24-hour chapel. There's a tabernacle. It's not exposition, but Jesus is still there, right around the corner from here. And then obviously at the church 5 days a week. So it will change your life. Someone said that to me when I was in my 20s. I didn't believe them, but it has changed my life. And I just can't encourage it enough. Also, daily Mass. Your schedule may or may not allow that. But, we have daily Mass every day here. It's not always at a time where I can get to, but there's lots of other churches. And I would just say get to daily mass if you can. That is, again, another, I think, grace and blessing of not having a spouse or kids to run home to, or whatever the case may be. That may mean you have to get to bed earlier than you're used to, but again, it will change your life. So pray daily, which will help with the next stage, which is discern your vocation. If you haven't already done this, right? Discern your vocation. And so what does that mean? Well, there are 3 options, essentially. And that's one of the blessings of the Catholic Church is I have lots of friends who are Protestant, and, they kind of have like one option, get married. Like, that's it. Well, in Catholicism, we're blessed to have 3 options. Married life, which most people are called to, but not everyone. Religious life, priesthood or religious sister or brother. And then consecrated virgin. We have one in our parish, Karen Irvin, who just made her, is it called vows? Sort of?
She was consecrated.
Consecrated. So it's worth exploring those options. So for me, what that looked like was, as circumstance happened, I got to know the vocations director of the Arlington Diocese, who's still a great friend of ours. And I would just meet with him, and I'd say, hey, like, you're like inviting some guys to go on these discernment retreats and these discernment dinners, and like, you haven't invited me, so should I take that personally? And he was like, I just don't think you have the vocation. And I was like, great, because neither do I. But, he's like, trust me, you're not one of those guys who like, ducks his head and walks in the opposite direction when I come. And then I had another buddy, a close friend of mine, who actually was in seminary and who's now a priest. And he and I were talking about it. We'd go to some of these young adult parties and whatever, and he was like, yeah, dude, you don't have the vocation. But that's the beauty of discerning your vocations, that 2 parties have to say yes. It's the same in marriage or dating, and it's the same with the church. Like, seminary is essentially dating the church, and the church didn't want me, and that was fine. So, but it's good to discern that and to be open to that. I'm sure, I'm not too familiar with how it works in the Archdiocese, but I'm sure they do the same type of discernment retreats for men and for women and all that. So check it out. Be open. You never know what God has in store. But the whole point of it is where we're going to find our joy and where we're going to find our peace is being in the center of God's will, right? I mean, like, where else are we going to find it? And right now, unless, like, you heard or felt God telling you to marry someone or to pursue religious life, like, if you happen to be single and you just haven't discerned it yet or who that person is, you are in the center of God's will, right? If you're prayerfully discerning that, so embrace that. In the same way when you're married, like, even when there are struggles, it's good to just remind ourselves that my path to holiness is with and through Becky, and hers with mine, like, with me. And so there's great peace in that, and there's great peace in knowing that this is how I'm going to get to heaven, and this is how she's going to get to heaven. And being in the center of God's will is really what it's all about. Okay. A few other things. Work at something you're passionate about and lean into your work. So, I'm amazed at how many people, and I work with some of them, not to say you should be a workaholic or work crazy hours just because you don't have a spouse or kids to go home to. With that being said, if you're doing something you're passionate about, lean into your work. This is a great opportunity to grow in your career, to whatever that may be. And maybe it's for more money, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's just for more responsibility or more fulfillment or whatever. And so I spent the majority of my 20s working in nonprofits that I was really passionate about. And I got to do some really cool and fun and exciting things. And now I have a great job that I'm blessed to have, but there's a different dynamic. As Becky and I were discerning my last job transition, it was like, all right, I'm not like 25 and single anymore. I have a wife and 3 kids to raise and feed and a roof over our head that I got to pay the mortgage on. And so it's like, all right, that dynamic, that discernment, that prudence shifts. But when I was 25, I was raising my own support, working as a missionary in West Africa, and having like the time of my life, and not that you can't be a missionary in Africa if that's what God calls you to when you're married and have kids. Many people do it, but trust me, it gets a lot harder, right? And all right, so I would just say that. And then in terms of leaning into your work, this is a good opportunity to try and advance your careers. I worked way more hours when I was single than I do now, just because I could, right? And I can't reasonably work 60 hours a week now and be present to Becky and to the boys. I just can't. There aren't enough hours in the day. And so lean into your work. Okay, next, invest in friendships. So I look back and I was so blessed to have and still have so many incredible friendships from every season of my life. But here's one thing I would just say about that. And some of you may find yourself in similar situations. At every season of life, I was blessed with some really awesome male friends and some really awesome female friends. And really incredible people. Women who, if they were guys, they would have stood up at my wedding with me. And I don't regret the friendships, but I would say this. Once you get married, those relationships are going to change, right? You're not going to be close friends, and you really shouldn't be close friends with members of the opposite sex. It's just not appropriate. It's not honoring to your spouse. It's not honoring to their spouse if and when they get married. So the dynamics are going to change. So in the spirit of what am I going to invest my time in my singlehood that's going to last hopefully throughout my life? Well, I would argue to invest in friendships of the same sex. And sometimes that's tricky. There have been seasons of life where it's just hard to meet cool dudes that I got along with and whatever that may be. But I would just throw that out there and say, really pursue healthy, holy, fun, adventurous friendships, particularly with people of the same gender. It'll save you a lot of stress once you're married. Next, just to throw it out there, not everyone loves to travel, but I do and did, and I would encourage you to travel. And I'll kind of say travel and volunteer together, not that they're necessarily related. They happen to be a little bit for us, but we both had an opportunity before we met to spend semesters abroad in college and travel around Europe. We've both volunteered overseas for a number of months. Becky spent 3 months in India before we met. I spent about a year in West Africa, and we just got to see the world, meet new people, learn about ourselves, learn about other cultures, and I'm trying to think, since we've had kids, except for Canada, we have not left the country together. And it will probably be many years until we do. So that's just life, and that's reality, and that's fine. And but look for opportunities to travel. Look for opportunities to volunteer. It doesn't have to be overseas. It doesn't have to be for months on end. But look for opportunities to volunteer. There's a decent chance you might meet your spouse doing that. There's a decent chance you might meet friends with similar interests doing that. And the last thing I would just say is do not despair, right? God has a vocation for everyone, and it's part of our journey to discern it. And I just think now that if back when I was in my 20s, if I knew that, at 32, I was going to marry her and we were going to have this life together, man, I wouldn't have had a worry in the world. I would have lived out my 20s without any concern, making tons of friends, traveling, volunteer, leaning into work, praying, doing all this stuff, with just nothing but joy and peace. And look, maybe you'll get married at 32, maybe you won't, maybe God has a different vocation for you, maybe you won't meet someone till you're 40, whatever the case may be, it doesn't matter. If you are discerning God's will, and if you're in the center of it, the joy that he has, the peace that he has, the fulfillment he has, it's yours today. It's not for if and when sometime in the future. So, and I know that can be hard. I know it's you're the guy who's been married 8 years, you forget what it was like. No, I remember, it was yesterday what it was like. And I'm just saying, God's got it covered. Spend time with him, discern his will, live life to the fullest, and you won't have any regrets. All right?
All right, so I get to talk about tips for dating. Not that we're experts by any means, but we just want to share some tips based on our experience. So number one, just be open. Make yourself available, just like what you're doing tonight. I mean, this is key. Just surrounding yourself with like-minded, faithful people. Joe mentioned we were out in D.C. and we both attended lots of young adult events. My friends and I, especially this one friend in particular, we literally, I think, went to every single Catholic young adult event that we heard about. One night that included 3 different parties or events and a wardrobe change in the McDonald's bathroom. Really. Like, we were insane, but there was always that hope in the back of my mind, like, maybe this is where I'm going to meet my future spouse. So, yeah, just be open. And we would say go out with almost anyone at least once. Give people a chance. And it doesn't have to be anything lengthy. For us, we did go out for dinner, but Joe had planned dessert for only if it was going well. He didn't tell me that part, but only if it was going well, he had planned dessert, and we went out for dessert. So it could just be coffee, quick run.
Yeah, so the way it was is like, I got to this point where, like I said, I didn't get married until I was 32, so I had a decent number of first dates in the journey, and you know, there's enough awkward stories that we don't have time to share, but like, I would just say first dates, I got to the point where it was like, keep them short and kind of simple and not overcommitted, you know, because early on they were way overcommitted, and so I kind of had this thing where I always had the second stop planned. Like if the first stop went well, whatever that was, drink, coffee, dinner, like there was a second stop. And so friends, you know, my friends would always ask, like, "Oh, did you make it to the second stop?" And you know, sometimes yes.
All right, tip number 2. How many of you have seen the movie Hitch? All right, so you may remember in there, he says the third date is the high stakes medal round. You remember that? You remember that? No, some of you? All right, well, we would say if you're not feeling that it could have potential by then, move on. Like, don't waste anyone's time. And for us, the third date really was key. So Joe shared how he met at the Frisbee game. What he didn't tell you was a week before that, the Sunday before that, I was sitting around having brunch with some female friends, and the conversation quickly turned to boys, as it usually did. So everyone was going around just kind of sharing where they were at, you know, who they were interested in, who they had gone out with, who they wanted to ask, who they wanted to ask them out. So it got around to me, and I think it was the first time in my life where there was nobody that I was interested in at all, nobody on my radar. And it was discouraging. I was 27, and, you know, I discerned my vocation a couple years prior, and in those moments, it was tough. It was tough to trust God. You know, all the lies start coming in. Maybe I'm just not praying enough. Maybe I'm not praying the right way. Maybe God doesn't love me enough. You know, all these lies start coming in. But, yeah, at that brunch, there was no one. That week, I met 3 guys. 2 of whom asked me out because the other guy couldn't because it was his cousin who asked me out. And then Joe was one of those
Winner!
So the 2 guys asked me out. I went out with one guy on Friday night, went out with Joe on Sunday night. I was interested in both of them. So what do? The next weekend, I went out with both again. I was still interested in both of them. What do? So what I did is I called up my spiritual director in a panic. And I'm like, Father Juan, I like both of them, but like both were kind of progressing quickly enough that like I knew I would have to be exclusive with one or the other. I couldn't just like continue down that path, just dating both of them, but I didn't know which one to choose. So he asked me, he said, what if both of them showed up to your door at the same time and asked you out for that night? Who would you choose? Without any hesitation, I said, Joe, of course. So the other guy, I felt like I had gotten to know him a little bit more because in between the dates, we had some mutual friends that we had hung out with. But there was just something about Joe that I knew I wanted to get to know him more. So I went out with him a 3rd time. And after that day, I came back. I remember running into my roommate's room. I said, I like him. I think he's the one. Literally, I knew on that 3rd date he was the one I was going to marry. And it wasn't that anything magical happened. It's not like God spoke to me. But I really did just know. And a couple days after that date, there was this young adult mass in Arlington that I went to. He wasn't even there. But before mass, I knelt down and I was just praying. And I was just very humbled. And I was thanking God for Joe if he was in fact supposed to be my future spouse. And a key piece to all of this was a couple years prior, when I had discerned my vocation, my spiritual director gave me some advice. And if you haven't done this and you think marriage is your vocation, I would suggest doing this. He said, in prayer, make a list of qualities that you're looking for in your future spouse. And he said to be specific. So I did that. I was very specific. I made a long list of things that I was looking for. And over the next couple of years, I had dated different guys, and they had met different aspects of the list. There was one guy who pretty much met everything on the list, but I just was not attracted to him at all. Like, I just couldn't force it. So then along comes Joe, and he met every single item on the list perfectly and more. Like, things that were important to me, but I didn't even think to write down. Like, he met them. So I was just sitting there, and Matt's just like thanking God. Here's this fun, normal Catholic guy. Like, isn't that important, right? Like, you could say the same thing, like, fun, normal Catholic girl. Like, fun, normal Catholic guy who was striving for holiness and who integrated it into every aspect of his life in just like a normal way. Like, this is just how one should live life. So I was kneeling there, and I just kind of started crying, and I was just struck by God's love for me. That's the time that I look back and I can most concretely feel God's love for me, because he answered my prayer, and he answered it like so perfectly and so obviously, and I was so struck that like he would love me that much to give me Joe. So that's kind of a long story to say that if you're not feeling it by the third date, move on.
I still bring her to tears just for different reasons.
Okay, tip number 3. The purpose of dating is discernment. So date until you have discerned God's will, not longer, not shorter. I think some people stay in relationships longer than they should because they're afraid they won't meet anyone better. And I think this can be a bigger temptation as one gets older. People start to fear that, that pool of good guys or the pool of good women, it's shrinking and I might not meet anyone else. But worse than being single would be being in a miserable marriage. So that's just not a good idea. And I didn't tell you I was going to share this story, but this is slightly different, but kind of going along with this. Joe?
Talking of being in a miserable marriage.
No. Joe shared this story with me when we were dating. I was just kind of struck by it. He said that when he had dated other women, he would go to an event like this maybe, and part of him was always kind of looking around like, who's that other person? I might want to get to know her better. Maybe that person over there, I'd get along with her better than this person. There was always that what else is out there kind of thing. But he said when he met me, he didn't do that anymore. He stopped wondering who else was out there who might be better. So for him, that was just confirmation that I was the right one. So I guess, if you're thinking who else is out there who might be better, that's probably a good sign that the person you're with isn't the right one. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that one. The kind of the flip side of this is some people end relationships too soon because they're afraid of commitment. I think that's just kind of a big part of our culture, and I think a lot of times has to do with past wounds. If you think that might apply to you, just take it to prayer. Ask God to heal those wounds. There's always counseling that can be really helpful to kind of work through any past hurts or wounds. Next tip. I'm going to make this short because we've talked about this, but pray together for discernment. Can't say enough. Pray, pray, pray. We started out praying right off the bat in our relationship, and was it awkward? It was for me. I think he felt more comfortable, but sometimes people feel awkward praying with another person, but still do it. That helped us with our discernment, and it's kind of like a muscle. The more you do it, the easier it gets. I would just encourage you to pray together. Next step. Get to know each other's friends and family. Family of origin matters have been the most relevant in our marriage and sometimes the most challenging. So we got engaged pretty quickly. After that first date, I had made a comment that I wouldn't get engaged before 6 months. I don't know. That was just like some random thing I'd thrown out there. Like, oh, anyone can hide anything for 6 months. It didn't pertain to him in particular, but he waited until our 6-month anniversary then to propose. So 6 months after our first date. So we didn't know.
I had always said I wouldn't propose before 12 months because I wanted to, see someone every season and just give proper discernment. But as Becky said, it was around the third date for me as well. That was just like, no, this is the one. And so it was actually tough to wait 6 months, but I wanted to honor kind of what she had said, and we have a great engagement story, but we don't have time for that. So,
right.
Anyway. If you really want it.
That can be a Q&A. Now I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, so we didn't know each other's family very well. Not that if I had known his family more, I wouldn't have gotten engaged to him. Nothing like that. But I think I met his family twice. He had maybe met my family once or twice, something like that. But it's not that I just have interactions with his family. It's that his family has shaped who he is and vice versa. And it impacts everything from communication, how we deal with conflict, money, how we approach gift giving, vacations, holidays, food, parenting, everything. So that really is really important. Okay, the last tip. Live chastity. So Michelle talked about this, so I don't have to say a whole lot. But nothing clouds discernment like sexual sin. But it's hard, right? I mean, we got married just 8 years ago. It was hard still for us. And it should be hard. If you're thinking about marrying someone and it's not hard, that would mean you're not really attracted to them, right? So you wouldn't be marrying them. So it should be hard. But like Michelle said, if you stumble, just get to confession. Don't get so discouraged. I think the devil loves to keep the focus on ourselves, keep us discouraged. And I think, oh, I'm so miserable. I messed up again. I do this all the time. I say the same sins in confession. Why can't I just get over this sin? And it gets really frustrating. Instead, just focus on Christ. Take the focus off ourselves, put it on Christ, ask him for help, recommit, and just trust in his merciful love. That will help us more than anything. And that's it for my part.
All right, so just a few words on tips for breaking up.
That's the great cheerful
Look, regardless of which side you're on, or if it's as mutual as it can be, it sucks, right? It does. It sucks. So, but here's the thing. If you're faithfully praying for discernment, receive it as an answer to prayer. Receive it as being one step closer to discerning your vocation, because that's literally what it is, right? It's if you feel that God has closed this door, that closes, relationship with this person, then yeah, it's going to hurt in the short term, and you may have those questions about, am I making the right decision, or am I ever going to find someone else, or, whatever the case may be. But, really, that is the whole point of dating, is to discern whether, I can live my path of holiness or to holiness through this person, and vice versa. And sometimes that answer is going to be yes, or one time that answer is going to be yes, and the rest of the times it's going to be no. And, and it's easier said than done. If anyone is here tonight who's recently coming out of a relationship, I'm not trying to be insensitive about this by any stretch, but really, receive it as an answer to prayer, and realize that with time and with prayer, it will heal all wounds, right? It will. And then the other thing I would just say is, it's a lot easier to break up with someone if you've lived a chaste relationship. And why is that? Well, you've probably talked about oxytocin at some point, and
Oops.
well, there are hormones that are exchanged in the marital act and breastfeeding, and is there another one, or are those the two pretty much that create bonding between people? And so, if you're not living chastely, you've created these hormonal bonds that do just make it harder. Not to mention just the emotions of it all. So, going back to what Becky and what Michelle have shared earlier, like, and it's never too late to live a chaste marriage. We mentor some engaged couples, and I was just so moved by this couple who we recently mentored, who, just to say, like, they had been sleeping together, and as they grew in faith, realized that, like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Maybe this isn't actually what's best for us. And they stopped, and they, throughout, I don't know all the details, but throughout the majority of their engagement, or maybe all their engagement, they did live chastely. And how awesome is that? How beautiful that is. Like, it's never too late to live chastely. So no matter what your past is, or no matter what your current situation is with your boyfriend or girlfriend, like, it's not too late to live chastely. Like, you're just one confession away from it, essentially. The other thing I would just say on a very practical note is it does make it easier to end a relationship if you haven't said I love you to each other. And this is I'm sure controversial, and people will be like, Joe, you're wrong, you know what you're talking about. But let me tell you,
I added it to the questions for them for their discussion. So
great.
Agree or disagree.
Great. But I will preach this from the mountaintop. First of all, think about it. Do you really want to look back over your singlehood or your dating life once you're married and be like, oh yeah, I said I love you to her and to her and to her, but like, obviously I didn't mean it in the same way I mean it to my wife. So, so why say it? Even if you feel that way. I mean, I'm not saying you don't love that person. I'm not saying you're lying by any stretch. But it does add an emotional dynamic to a relationship that I think is better reserved for at least engagement, if not marriage. I think it's a way to guard your heart and to guard her heart or his heart. And I think it's a way to honor your future spouse, quite honestly. So, and so you don't want to end up in this awkward situation where, you're having like this romantic evening, each other's great date, and like she's like, oh, I love you, and you're like, crap, I can't say it. Like, I said I wasn't going to say it. Joe said not to say it. Now, like, I got to say it. So my approach was like, somehow it came up before we were at that point where like we were ready to say it to each other. I don't remember exactly how it came up. Maybe you do. You have a better memory for these things. But basically, I just said to her, like, I'm not going to say I love you to someone until I'm down on one knee with a ring in my hand.
It's probably that conversation where I said I wouldn't get engaged before 6 months,
right.
Kind of thing.
Yeah. And literally, we did not say it to each other until I proposed to her. And
but it was like, I like you. I really like you. I more than really like you. But when he first said it, I was like, you're kind of weird. But then when he like explained it, I'm like, it really does make sense. And I really did appreciate then that he did save it to make sure I was the only person he would end up saying it to for the rest of his life in that context. Unless I die, of course, and you remarry. But let's hope that doesn't happen.
Right, let's hope that doesn't happen.
Good ending.
Yeah, so on that note, any questions?
I have it in their questions that you don't say I love you until you wait until you know you will never say it to another.